Hey guys, in today's video I'm going to present the top 5 volleyers in the history of tennis. And I'm not necessarily talking about serve and volley. I'm taking the volley stroke in isolation, whether it be a forehand volley or a backhand volley. And unfortunately, serve and volley has died out, not completely. There are a few players on tour currently who utilize serve and volley. Before the 2000s, most of the top players served and volleyed on their first serves and their second serves. But not only that, they also came in off the return. So naturally, players that I'm going to feature in today's rankings are all retired because the best volleyers are in the past. And here's one thing that you have to understand. If somebody wants to be a serve and volleyer on tour, they can't make up their mind mid-career. This is something you have to do in juniors. You have to grow up as a serve and volley player to be able to utilize that game style in the pros. Can you use it every now and then as a changeup? Of course, and a lot of players do that. But to be able to serve and volley like the players used to on every single first and second serve, this is something that has to be done early in development so that you can develop the necessary skills to be able to pull that game style off. A lot of people say that game style wouldn't work in today's powerful ground stroke game, and there might be some truth to that depending on how slow the balls are and how slow the surface is. However, I will say that I've seen it work even on clay because nowadays players are not used to the other player coming to the net off the serve and it throws off their rhythm. So I do think that serve and volley doesn't necessarily have to be dead. And before we get started with the top 5, I'm going to put some respect on some of the great volleyers from the past. And I'm going to read some names of players that didn't quite make my top 5 rankings. Michael Lodra, Michael Stich, Martina Navratilova, Pat Cash, Tim Henman, Bob and Mike Bryan, Jana Novotná, Feliciano Lopez, Radek Stepanek, Richard Krajicek, Yannick Noah, Henri Leconte, and Rod Laver. And coming in at number 5 is Boris Becker. And when I grew up in Germany, the coolest thing ever was to dive on the volleys. I did it on clay, I did it on carpet indoors, and I had a lot of bruises back in those days because that was the coolest thing we've ever seen on a tennis court, having the ability to dive and put a volley away. And Boris Becker had a rock solid volley. His advantage was the fact that he was one of the greatest servers in the history of the game. So he often had easy volleys to put away. But even when he had difficult volleys, the fact that he was an incredible fighter, an unbelievable athlete, a strong guy, his volleys were so rock solid, so firm. When he struck the forehand or the backhand volley, nothing was moving. He had ability to handle low balls, wide balls. He had incredible control. But not only that, just imagine playing Becker, who was a very imposing person. It is very intimidating when somebody like that comes charging at you to the net. So a combination of all these things makes Boris Becker the 5th greatest volleyer in the history of tennis. And coming in at number 4 is Pete Sampras. And very similar to Becker, Pete Sampras had one of the greatest serves in the history of tennis. And he often only had to clean up at the net and put easy volleys away. But a lot of people don't realize how good of an athlete Pete Sampras was. Maybe because he was wearing these baggy shorts and baggy t-shirts. But Pete Sampras was one of the greatest athletes that ever stepped foot on a tennis court. And he used his athletic ability to play an attacking serve and volley style where he was nearly unbreakable. A combination of rock solid volleys, just like Becker. You take a look at a Sampras volley, there's nothing moving. It's so firm, so compact, so rock solid. The placement was phenomenal. Just like Becker, he was an aggressive volleyer and he was looking to put a lot of pressure on the opponent or even sometimes put the volley away right off the bat. And coming in at number 3 is Pat Rafter. And you're probably wondering, Nick, why in the world would you put Pat Rafter ahead of Sampras and Becker? Didn't Sampras and Becker have better careers and win more slams? Yes, they did. But the reason why I put Rafter at number 3, because I'm judging the volley in isolation as a stroke. And fact is that Sampras and Becker had monster serves and Patrick Rafter did not. In fact, he would often slice or kick his first serve and come to the net. So what that means is that he had to volley on the vast majority of the service points where he came to the net, and often these were difficult volleys around his shoelaces. And he not only was a very aggressive volleyer looking to put pressure on the opponent. Incredible control and precision with his volleys. But Patrick Rafter, in my opinion, had the best volley drop shot in the history of tennis. He also changed his volleys up and would put side spin at times, under spin, and he had unbelievable touch and would perform the most unbelievable drop volleys you have ever seen. Just like Sampras and Becker, Rafter was a phenomenal athlete and was able to cover the court at the net phenomenally well. And coming in at number 2 is Stefan Edberg. Technically the cleanest volley in the history of tennis, and Edberg, very similar to Rafter, had to volley on most of the serves where he came in on. He didn't have that big of a serve, relatively speaking. He would often kick his first serve, which gave him a little bit more time to come to the net. And Edberg was an aggressive volleyer, so he didn't play the volley with as much feel as Rafter. He was looking to put pressure on the opponent or perform an outright winner with the volley. And all the players that I'm mentioning in the top 5 have an equal forehand and backhand volley, but if you take a look at Stefan Edberg's backhand volley, it is technically the most beautiful backhand volley in the history of tennis. See, in the 2000s, the volley swings have increased, especially a player like Federer does lag the racket behind the body quite a bit. And he also has more of a finish on his volley. So the swings were much larger in the 2000s. However, when I studied some of the great volleyers pre the 2000 era, those volleys were much more compact because the game was extremely fast back in those days. The balls were fast, the surfaces were fast, and there was simply not enough time to take the racket back. So Edberg had one of the most compact volleys in the history of tennis. It was incredibly firm, it was incredibly stable. And if you get a chance to look up a picture of Edberg back in his prime, his legs were about this wide. Edberg was one of the greatest athletes to ever step foot on the tennis court, and he could cover the net phenomenally well. And coming in at number 1, the undisputed king of all volleys is John McEnroe. See, often in tennis, some things are gifted to you by your genetics. And John McEnroe was one of the most gifted tennis players in the history of tennis, if not the most gifted. And if you take a look at a compilation of McEnroe volleys on YouTube, you'll see that his net game was just like poetry, and his technique was somewhat unconventional. His volleys weren't as rock solid, technically speaking, compared to Rafter, Edberg, Sampras, and Becker. There was more movement there, especially on the backhand side. The racket would drop somewhat, and the great Oscar Wagner explained the McEnroe volley in the following way. If you ever notice that McEnroe had a tendency to stand up on his volley and kind of puff his chest out and straighten his leg, well, Wagner's theory was that because his racket had a tendency to drop, by him straightening the body, this would even out the racket. In other words, the racket would go down, but the body would go up, and that would mean that the racket was actually staying at the same level. And if you want to talk about touch, hands, feel, John McEnroe is the undisputed king. You could see it when you watch him play. The amount of feel that he had on the volley. He could put that ball anywhere he wanted in the court, and the contact was so butter soft. It was truly magnificent to watch. It was as close to genius as you can get on the tennis court. McEnroe had a very underrated serve. So his lefty serve was extremely lively and had a lot of power, and it was incredibly difficult to return, especially when he sliced it through the tee on the deuce side and when he went out wide on the ad side. Those serves were extremely difficult to return, and often McEnroe had the entire court to work with and had an easy look at a volley winner. But where McEnroe was at his absolute best was in emergency situations where he had to utilize his natural talent, his hands, his feel, and he would come up with the most spectacular drop volleys, half volleys, block volleys. So for those reasons, I'm putting John McEnroe at number 1 as the greatest volleyer in the history of tennis. And how about the big 3? Well, I left them out of my list of greatest volleyers who didn't make the top 5 because I wanted to talk about them separately, and they do belong on that list. And the greatest volleyer in the 2000s is without a doubt Roger Federer. See, early on when Federer beat Sampras in Wimbledon for the first time, he was still serving volleying, but then Federer adapted to the more modern serve and stay at the baseline game. He has exceptional feel, exceptional reflexes, and he can be quite imposing a la Sampras and Becker where he comes in off that incredibly precise serve, and he's a very difficult force to deal with once he's at the net. And a lot of people don't realize that Rafael Nadal is very similar in that regard. He is one of the greatest volleyers of the 2000s. Nadal is a great doubles player. Now, he volleys differently from many of the greats because he will often use underspin. He likes to angle his volleys off, and Nadal will only come in easy situations. I will say that, and this is something that's very smart, and this is something that I personally coach to a lot of players, that you want to make your life at the net as easy as possible, and that's what Nadal does. He hits an incredible approach shot, for example, and he comes in where the likelihood of winning the point at the net is very high. And for that reason, his volleys don't have to be that difficult. That can be kind of curved off the court. And when he does that, his success rate is sky high. So for that reason, Rafael Nadal is one of the best volleyers in the 2000s. But the most underrated volleyer in the 2000s is Novak Djokovic. He didn't have the greatest volley when he first came on tour, but he continuously worked on it, and now he is an exceptional volleyer. If you saw the tournament in Cincinnati where he beat Alcaraz, he came to the net and was volleying like Stefan Edberg. In the final of the US Open against Medvedev, Djokovic was serving volleying a lot and was doing reflex volleys at the net like McEnroe. So Novak Djokovic is by far the most underrated volleyer of the 2000s. And what can you learn from the greatest volleyers of all time apart from their athleticism, where you can obviously try to get yourself in the best physical condition as possible, which is going to help your volley game in singles tremendously. Maybe not so much in doubles, where there are situations where you are already at the net. But if you want to play singles and be successful at the net, athleticism is hugely important. But apart from that, the one thing that all the greatest volleyers in history have in common is stability at the moment of contact. And this is one of the biggest problem areas at the recreational level. And how do you improve stability at the moment of contact? Well, you can come to the wall. This is one of the greatest volley exercises there is. Your arm will get tired, your forearm muscles and your hand muscles are going to strengthen because of this. You're going to learn to keep a stable, firm racket head at the moment of contact, especially on the backhand volley where a lot of players have issues. And you simply come out here for 20 minutes a day, or maybe even 10 minutes a day, and trust me, your volley is going to improve tremendously as a result of it. You gotta remember that after all, the volley is a deflective shot. If you take a look at the top 5, back in the day when tennis was a lot quicker, all these guys were masters of deflection at the net.